Okay, so what are these tax havens, and where are they? You're familiar, I take it, with Corruption Perceptions Index, Transparency International. Anyone from Transparency International here? TI? Well, I think their index, they've done a great job in putting corruption onto the agenda, but I think that they only told a part of the story. And in 2006, the Royal Geographical Society in London asked me to give a talk, the keynote address at their annual conference, actually, on the theme of the geography of corruption. And I said, look, we painted a picture of corruption which has a black face. We have. Because if you look at the Corruption Perceptions Index, it's all Africa and Latin America and blah, 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 blah. Look at the other end of the index and a very interesting story emerges. Over 50% of the least corrupt countries in the world are tax havens, according to the Corruption Perceptions Index. Singapore, Hong Kong, Switzerland, Luxembourg. What's going on here? So we challenged them when we produced a different index which looks at financial secrecy, what we call the supply side corruption. Because if you're going to engage in high-level corruption, you have to have a very sophisticated infrastructure of lawyers, accountants, and banks that will help you to shift $4.5 billion in the case of Abacha out of Nigeria. It doesn't, you know, you can't run enough trucks across the desert to move that much cash. In the case of Gaddafi, the best estimate we have is that 50 to 250 billion has disappeared, simply disappeared from Libya over the course of the last 40 years. Not just him, but all his entourage. And where's it ended up? Well, a lot of it in London, as it happens. And that's not coincidence, because London is the money launderer's destination of choice. So have a look at this index, because what this index tells is a very different story about corruption. When we published it last month, the second time round, the first time round we had the United States at the top of the list, and my goodness, that attracted some press attention. But this time round, Switzerland very well deservedly came out at the top, followed by Luxembourg, Cayman, Hong Kong, Singapore, United States, Jersey, my home island, because these places provide, forget about the tax breaks, they provide secrecy par excellence. If you really want to hide what you're doing, you hide it behind offshore trusts, you hide it behind offshore companies, you hide it in Swiss banks. But no one in the world, apart from the very unsophisticated, would simply use an offshore bank account. They will almost always use offshore trusts and offshore foundations. So Switzerland is a big player here, but here, if you visit the website, are all the 73 jurisdictions that we cover this time around. Eventually we plan to cover the entire world. Because even the best players in the world, Denmark and Spain down here at the bottom, are moderately secretive because of treaty failures or gaps in their legislation. But up here, Maldives and Nauru, anywhere from 60, a score of 60 and above, you get into the territory where you have an enabling environment where you can hide who you are, what money's happening, what your company's up to. And that's what we call the supply side of corruption. Does that make sense? And interestingly, importantly, although GB comes here, Great Britain, over half of the players here are British territories, former colonies, now overseas territories, or crown dependencies, Cayman Islands, British Virgin Islands, and so on. Britain is a very, very big player in this area. And if you look at the international politics of this over the last 80 years, it's been Britain, United States, Switzerland, Netherlands, Luxembourg that have been blocking progress consistently. And if you look at the countries that have been trying to push for progress to tackle this, it's been developing countries that have been beaten up consistently, whether it's the OECD, or the United Nations, or IMF. Until now, until this year, developing countries have been blocked. I say until this year because something very interesting is happening. For the last 10 years, I make an annual penance to Geneva to attend the annual session of the United Nations Committee of Experts on International Cooperation and Tax Matters. Hands up, anyone has heard of this august organisation. I promise you, We were the first NGOs to ever attend their sessions back in 2003 when they were formed. There was one other civil society organisation there, it was the International Chamber of Commerce, represented by the Swiss bank UBS. Yeah, exactly. But we've not been paying attention to this organisation. And it's very, very important because this was elevated to committee status in 2003 as part of the Monterey Consensus. It was Kofi Annan who pushed for it to shape the international frameworks for developing countries to be able to wrest power away from the OECD to the UN to shape policies that favour developing countries. But up till now, up till this year, the OECD countries have dominated this committee of experts. UK, Switzerland, United States. What happened this year is the Chinese and the Indians, supported by Chile and Brazil, turned around and said, no, we are now going to shape international conventions for our interests, and we're no longer going to adopt automatically OECD policies into our frameworks. So there's a very interesting power play at work here. I could tell you more about how we shaped that index of ours if you want, but I might skip that. But you're very welcome to ask questions about it. It's based upon 214 different bits of information taken from laws, regulations, and so on for each of the countries covered, and we then filter them down, distill them down to 15 key indicators in 4 key categories, and that's the basis on which we arrive at a score for every single country covered by our index. We then weight the score against IMF data on shares of global markets in offshore financial services. That's how we arrive at the situation where Switzerland, which is quite secret, but quite a large player, ends up at the top. Because Switzerland is not nearly as secretive as the Maldives, but let's face it, Maldives aren't big players in this area.